I am Major Lily Woods, 35 years old. The dirt on my husband Marcus's grave isn't even dry yet. My palms still hold the stiff creases of the American flag handed to me at the funeral, and already I've been ordered to be evicted from my own life. Standing on the porch in Charleston, I heard the dry scrape of metal on metal. My key didn't fit the lock. Peering through the glass, I saw my father-in-law Raymond directing my brothers-in-law to strip my blood-stained medals from the wall of honor and toss them into a trash bin. Family assets returned to the bloodline Lily. His voice grated from inside. Behind him, my mother-in-law Patricia smiled at me, a smile as sweet as Southern iced tea, but laced with pure contempt. They treated me like a sentry whose shift had ended, but they made a fatal mistake. They thought they were bullying a lonely widow. They had no idea they had just stepped directly into a legal minefield my husband prepared. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And hit subscribe if you've ever felt like an outsider in the place you called home. The heat in Charleston was a physical weight, damp and heavy like a wet wool blanket. I stood on that porch, the humidity slicking my neck, and felt the vibration of the lock through my wrist. Metal on metal. A stubborn, hollow click. A $20 quick-set deadbolt was the only thing standing between me and the hallway where Marcus and I had spent the last 8 years. I didn't kick the door. I didn't scream. That's what they expected. They wanted the hysterical widow. They wanted a show. I gave them silence instead. Peering through the sidelight, I saw Gerald. He was Marcus's older brother, a man who had never broken a fingernail in his life. He was red-faced, sweating through a crisp linen shirt as he hauled a cardboard box toward the curb. Behind him, Timothy was laughing. They weren't just moving things. They were erasing me. They were pulling down my shadow box from the wall, the one holding my bronze star and my unit patches, and dumping them into a black heavy-duty trash bag like they were yesterday's coffee grounds. Family assets returned to the bloodline Lily. Raymond's voice was a low growl muffled by the heavy mahogany door but sharp enough to cut. I stepped back, 1, 2, 3 paces. I broke the line of sight from the glass. This was a tactical retreat. I didn't look at them. I looked at the terrain. I turned my back on the house and walked down the gravel driveway, my combat boots crunching on the white stone. Every step was measured. My breathing was rhythmic, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. I reached my Jeep Wrangler parked under the sprawling limbs of a century-old live oak. The interior smelled of stale black coffee and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. I climbed in, pulled the door shut, and the world went quiet. I didn't start the engine. I reached for my field notebook and a ballpoint pen. I established my observation post, O.P. Alpha. I watched them through the rearview mirror. I noted the time. 14:22. I recorded the license plate numbers of the U-Haul and Gerald's Mercedes SUV. My hands were steady. They had to be. In the mirror, I caught a glimpse of Raymond through the window. He flicked his chin up, a dismissive gesture to the room, asserting his dominance over my living room. That chin flick, it was a time machine. Suddenly, I wasn't in a humid driveway. I was sitting at a mahogany table that sat 20, the air smelling of beeswax and expensive Cabernet. 8 years ago, my first dinner with the Colemans. I was in my Class A uniform. I had just come back from a tour, my brass polished, my creases sharp enough to draw blood. I felt like a soldier. Patricia looked at me and saw a janitor. She sipped her iced tea, the condensation on the glass matching the frost in her eyes. "It's so sturdy," Patricia said, her voice a saccharine trill. She gestured at my uniform. "But don't you find the fabric a bit coarse for a dinner party, dear? It looks so industrial." Raymond sat at the head of the table like a king on a crumbling throne. He was busy with a ribeye, the serrated blade of his knife rasping against the fine china. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Ohio." "Right," he asked. "The steel mills." "My father worked the furnace for 40 years, sir," I replied. "Manual labor." Raymond muttered, the red juice from his steak pooling on the white plate. "Honorable, I suppose. But it's a different world down here, Lily. We value stability. We value lineage. Your profession makes you a high-risk variable." He didn't wait for a response. He reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick envelope. He slid it across the polished wood. It didn't make a sound. "The prenuptial agreement," he said. "Standard procedure for a family of our standing. It ensures the Coleman estate remains with the Colemans, especially given your frequent deployments. We can't have the family legacy tied up in military probate if something were to happen. The paper felt cold against my fingertips. It wasn't an agreement, it was a perimeter fence. It was their way of saying I was a guest who would never be family. I looked at Marcus. He was staring at his wine glass, his jaw tight, his knuckles white against the stem. He knew. He hated it, but he knew. I picked up the pen. My father had taught me that a Woods never backs down from a fight. I signed the paper. I looked Raymond straight in the eye, my face a mask of steel. I didn't realize then that I wasn't signing a contract. I was declaring war. Back in the Jeep, I watched Gerald toss my favorite ceramic mug, the one Marcus bought me in Savannah, onto the pile of trash. It shattered. I gripped the pen until it nearly snapped. I didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry when the enemy breaches the wire. They reload. I picked up my phone. It was time to call in the heavy artillery. My hands were built for triggers, grease, and heavy lifting. They weren't meant for the delicate dance of knitting needles. But for 3 months tucked away in my quarters between grueling drills and late-night briefings, I forced them to learn. I bought the finest teal cashmere with my last batch of hazard pay. Every stitch was a quiet plea for a truce. I wanted to show Patricia that I could be soft. I wanted to prove I could build something beautiful instead of just surviving the wreckage. The wool felt alien against my calluses, catching on the rough skin of my palms that had been scarred by hot brass and desert sand. By Christmas Eve, the scarf was finished, a piece of my own sanity woven into 6 feet of fabric. The Coleman estate was drowning in excess. Giant fir trees dripping with heirloom glass, the smell of expensive pine, and the sound of silver clinking against fine china. I handed the box to Patricia, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. She opened it with 2 fingers, her manicured nails clicking against the cardboard. She didn't even pull the scarf out. She didn't let the wool touch her skin. She just stared at it like it was a dead rodent someone had dragged onto her Persian rug. A thin plastic smile stretched across her face, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "How industrious of you, Lily." Patricia said, her voice a saccharine trill that made the hair on my arms stand up. She didn't look at me. She turned to Eleanor, the young maid standing near the buffet. "Here, Eleanor, take this. It matches that cheap coat you wear. Consider it a bonus." She tossed the box my 3 months of patience and hoped to the girl as if it were trash. My breath hitched in my throat. I felt the heat rise in my neck, a slow burn of pure humiliation. Before I could even blink, Patricia reached into her silk handbag and pulled out a heavy green box. She snapped the lid open with a sharp clack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Inside sat a Rolex Submariner, the brushed steel gleaming under the chandelier. "For Marcus," she announced, her voice dripping with a different kind of pride. "A real gift for a real Coleman. Blood deserves the best after all." The message was a jagged piece of shrapnel. I wasn't blood. I was a high-risk variable, a guest whose time was running out. I looked at Marcus, but he was already being swarmed by his brothers, their laughter booming as they admired the watch. I was standing right there, but I was invisible. Fast forward 6 months. A humid, suffocating afternoon in Charleston. We were at a cousin's wedding, one of those high-society outdoor events where the air smells like rotting pluff mud and $300 perfume. The white tents were sprawling across the lawn and the mint juleps were flowing. Patricia spent the whole afternoon parading me around like a rescued stray dog. She'd grip my arm tight and tell her friends, "Our little soldier girl is so brave, even if she lacks refinement." I could feel the sweat itching under my dress. The social mask was suffocating me. I needed air. I needed to move. I used my old infantry habits. I didn't just walk away. I slipped into the shadows. I moved with the quiet grace of a scout, blending into the dark space behind the massive catering tent where the lawn gave way to the overgrown oaks. I just wanted 1 minute of silence and a cigarette. I pulled out my Zippo, the familiar weight of the metal comforting in my hand. I flicked it open, the flame dancing in the heavy air. But before I could light up, I heard voices, low, rasping, and full of teeth. It was Raymond. I could smell his expensive cigar, that heavy, cloying scent of aged tobacco. He was talking to Patricia and the 2 brothers-in-law, Gerald and Timothy. They were huddled together like a pack of wolves over a fresh kill. The doctor says the cancer is aggressive. Raymond's voice was a cold growl. We don't have long. We need to be ready the second Marcus stops breathing. The house, the clinic, everything stays in the family. We aren't letting that girl from Ohio walk away with a single cent of Coleman legacy. She thinks she's one of us. Patricia's voice was a jagged whisper. The audacity. I want the locks changed the day of the funeral. We'll put her on a bus back to those steel mills before she can even dry her eyes. We've counted the days, Raymond. We're almost there. Timothy chuckled, a wet, slimy sound. I already talked to a locksmith. We move fast. She's a soldier. She'll understand a tactical eviction. I stood there in the dark, my heart turned to a block of ice. They weren't mourning Marcus. They were measuring his coffin for a payout. They were counting his final heartbeats like coins in a jar. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out and scream. I gathered intel. I stayed perfectly still, recording every word in the tactical computer of my brain. I ground the cigarette out under the heel of my boot, crushing the embers into the dirt with a slow, deliberate twist. If you've ever been the black sheep in a den of wolves, or if you felt the sting of a family that only loves you when it's convenient, drop a "Stay Strong" in the comments right now. Your support keeps this channel alive. Like this video and subscribe to see how this soldier handles a den of snakes. It helps more than you know. I walked back toward the lights, my back straight, my chin level. I saw Marcus sitting in his wheelchair near the edge of the tent, looking pale and tired. He looked at me as I approached, a faint, weary smile on his lips. He had no idea he was being betrayed by his own blood. But I knew. I climbed into the passenger seat of our car, pulling the door shut with a heavy thud. I looked at him, my gaze sharp enough to draw blood. The truth was about to explode. The Ford's engine hummed a low, vibrating growl as we pulled away from the wedding tent. The heavy scent of stagnant swamp water and Patricia's expensive, suffocating perfume still clung to my hair. Marcus gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His knuckles were bone white, the skin stretched tight over his joints. The dashboard lights cast a sickly neon green glow over his face, making his sunken cheeks look like jagged craters. I didn't look at the road. I didn't look at the Spanish moss dripping from the oaks like skeletal fingers. I looked at the man who was dying next to me. He wasn't crying. He was driving like he was heading into a head-on collision. Situation report, I said. My voice was dry, flat, stripped of any wife-like comfort. It was pure data. Marcus didn't blink. Proceed. Target the Coleman clan. Intent total asset seizure. Timeline T-0 seconds after your final heartbeat. I paused, the words tasting like copper and old pennies in my mouth. They're already counting the silver Marcus. They've got a locksmith on speed dial. Raymond is talking about tactical evictions before your body is even cold. The truck swerved, a sharp, violent jerk on the asphalt as Marcus pulled onto the gravel shoulder of the dark South Carolina highway. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a ribcage. The only sound was the pinging of the cooling metal under the hood. Marcus didn't crumble. He didn't ask how I knew or weep about the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. He just exhaled a long, ragged sound that rattled deep in his fluid-filled lungs. I knew they were vultures, Marcus whispered, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield. I just didn't think they'd start circling while the heart was still beating. We didn't go to the bedroom when we got home. We went to the kitchen. It was small, cramped, with stained Formica countertops and a faucet that dripped with a steady, irritating rhythm. It was our bunker. Marcus moved slow every step, a brutal battle against the fatigue of the chemo that was eating him from the inside out. He sat at the small wooden table and reached under a pile of junk mail and utility bills. He pulled out a black leather briefcase. The latches popped with a sharp mechanical clack that sounded like a rifle bolt sliding into place. He didn't pull out family photos or old letters. He pulled out a thick stack of legal bond paper, the edges crisp and dangerous. My father thinks I'm the weak link, Marcus said, sliding a matte black business card across the table. It had one name embossed in cold silver ink, Charles Peaton. They think because I'm the gentle son, the vet who fixes puppies, I didn't see the wolves at the door. But I've spent my whole life watching them tear people apart for sport. I grew up in the den, Lily. I know how they bite. I picked up the card. The name Peaton carried weight in the South. He wasn't a family lawyer who handled messy divorces or real estate closings. He was a shark, a cleaner, a man who didn't bill by the hour. He billed by the kill. If Marcus had him on retainer, the war wasn't just coming, it was already funded. 3 lines of defense. Marcus set his finger trembling as he pointed to the first sheet of paper. Line 1. The house and the veterinary clinic. They're already moved into a living trust. Ownership transfers to you automatically the moment my death certificate is signed. No probate, no court dates, no waiting for a judge to decide if you're worthy. The moment I stop breathing, you own the air in this hallway. If they try to change the locks, they're committing a felony. I traced the ink on the page with my thumb. The paper felt heavy like a loaded magazine. Line 2. Marcus continued, his voice gaining a jagged edge of strength. The will. Everything, the savings, the equipment, even my grandfather's gold watch, it's all yours. I've documented every cent of family money I ever touched and paid it back into the estate years ago. There is no debt. There is no hook for them to snag. This is clean blood, Lily. Then he turned to the last page. His eyes narrowed, the green light from the stove clock reflecting in his pupils. This was the hammer. The no contest clause, he whispered. In South Carolina, it's a legal landmine. If Raymond, Gerald, or Timothy challenge this will in court, they are immediately and irrevocably disinherited from every secondary trust and family fund I have a stake in. They sue you, they lose their own safety nets. They get greedy, they get nothing. I've tied their hands with their own bank accounts. He looked at me then. Truly looked at me. Not as a husband looking at a wife, but as a commander looking at his most trusted officer before the wire is cut. They're going to come for you, Lily, he said. They'll start with the law, then they'll move to shame, and when that fails, they'll use force. They think you're just a girl from an Ohio steel town who got lucky and landed a Coleman. I stood up. My spine went straight, my shoulders squared. It was muscle memory from a decade in boots. The kitchen light flickered overhead, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. They think wrong, I said. Marcus reached out and took my hand. His skin was thin as parchment, cold and translucent, but his grip was iron. Major Woods, he said, using my rank like a sacred oath. Hold the line. Don't give them a single inch of ground. Let them stomp right into the middle of the minefield. Let them think they've won. Let them get comfortable in their greed. Understood, sir, I replied. I wasn't joking. The scene shifted with the brutal finality of a shutter flash. The smell of mahogany and coffee was gone, replaced by the stinging chemical scent of bleach and slow death. The kitchen faded into the antiseptic white of a hospital room. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Marcus lay under the thin, scratchy hospital sheets. He looked smaller now. Gray, the strategic genius, was trapped in a body that had surrendered. I sat in the hard plastic chair by the bed, my field notebook gripped in my lap. The strategic high-risk variable was no longer a theory. It was a countdown. The door to the room creaked open. I didn't turn around. I knew the scent of Patricia's perfume, heavy, expensive, and floral like lilies on a fresh grave. She stood in the doorway, her shadow stretching long and dark across the linoleum. It's almost over, Lily, she whispered, her voice holding a jagged edge of excitement she couldn't quite mask. I hope you've started packing your bags. The bus back to Ohio leaves early. I kept my eyes on Marcus's slowing heart rate. I felt the weight of the legal documents tucked into the bag at my feet. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Patricia, I said. The monitor let out a long, flat tone, a single, unending scream of electronic air. Marcus was gone. The war had officially begun. Time doesn't heal wounds, it just rots them. It had been 6 weeks since the kitchen briefing, 6 weeks of watching the man I loved dissolve into a ghost of himself. Pancreatic cancer doesn't negotiate. It's a scorched earth campaign. I had burned through every hour of emergency leave the Army allowed. I traded my desert camis for a plastic hospital chair that felt like sitting on a bed of nails. My world was now 14 by 14 feet. Antiseptic white walls. The hum of the HVAC. The chemical stench of bleach that never quite covered the smell of impending death. I sat by Marcus's bed, my back as straight as a steel girder. My eyes didn't wander. They were locked on the monitor. Green lines, jagged peaks. The rhythm of his life was stuttering. I used a damp cloth to wipe his forehead. These were hands that had packed shrapnel wounds in the back of a bouncing Humvee. Hands that had held a rifle steady for 18 hours straight in the Afghan heat. Now, they were trembling as I patted away the cold sweat from his yellowed skin. Then the door clicked open. Patricia entered. She didn't walk. She glided her heels, clicking on the linoleum like a metronome. She wore a black silk dress that cost more than my first truck. She carried a Tupperware container of chicken soup. It was a prop. She set it on the rolling tray table without looking at her son. She didn't touch his hand. She didn't kiss his forehead. She sat in the chair opposite me and pulled a thick, glossy catalog from her designer handbag. The sound of the pages turning was like a serrated blade across a nerve. Rustle. Flip. Rustle. "It's a shame about the house, Lily," Patricia said. Her voice was a soft, airy trill. She didn't look up from the page. "But we have to look forward. Raymond wants to modernize the estate. This Southern traditional look is so tired." I didn't answer. I kept the cloth moving. Wipe, fold, wipe. "Look at this, dear," she said, tapping a finger on a high-end furniture ad. "A cognac leather sofa. Sleek. Italian. Do you think that would work in the living room after you've cleared out your things? I worry about the floor plan once your oversized military trunks are gone." I sipped my lukewarm coffee. It tasted like battery acid. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a flinch. I just sipped and watched Marcus. My fingers gripped the edge of the scratchy hospital sheet until the fabric groaned. I wanted to lung punch her. I wanted to drag her out of that room by her perfectly coiffed hair. But I was a major. I was his officer. I held the line. The hallway was quiet, but not quiet enough. Through the heavy glass door, I saw Gerald and Timothy. They were leaned against the wall, drinking lattes. Their voices drifted in through the gap. "The locksmith said he can be there by 5 on Monday," Timothy whispered. He checked his gold watch. "If he goes on Sunday, we should have the house secured by the time she gets back from the funeral home. It's better to do it while she's distracted with the paperwork. We don't want a scene on the lawn." "Good," Gerald replied. He let out a low, dry chuckle. "Make sure they change the garage codes, too. I don't want her Jeep sitting in our driveway a minute longer than necessary." I looked at Marcus. His eyes were closed. His chest was barely moving. They were measuring him for a coffin, and they were measuring me for the curb. They treated him like a piece of depreciating real estate. They treated me like a squatting tenant. Suddenly, Marcus's hand twitched. His eyes snapped open. They were cloudy, rimmed with red, but for a split second the fog cleared. He saw them through the glass. He heard the rustle of Patricia's catalog. He turned his head toward me. The effort looked like it cost him every ounce of fuel he had left. He reached out his fingers, fumbling for my wrist. His grip was weak, but the intent behind it was a thunderclap. "Lily," he wheezed. His voice was a dry rattle of bone and air. I leaned in my ear, inches from his lips. Patricia stopped flipping pages. She leaned in too, her eyes hungry for his final words, probably hoping for a bank code. "Don't underestimate their greed," he whispered. He squeezed my hand, a sharp, sudden pressure. "Now, you know what to do. Trigger it." He stared at me, a final silent order. I nodded once, a crisp, military acknowledgement. His hand went limp. His eyes stayed open, but the light was gone. Beep! The heart monitor hit the flatline, a long electronic scream that filled the room. Patricia didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just let out a long, satisfied sigh and closed her catalog. She stood up, straightened her skirt, and walked toward the door to call the nurse. She didn't look back at the body. The scene dissolved. The white walls faded. The smell of bleach evaporated. I was back in the present. Back in the Jeep. The Charleston humidity was thick enough to chew. I was staring at the house with the new quick-set locks and the trash bags full of my life sitting on the curb. The oak trees were cast in long, jagged shadows. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise. I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I wasn't the grieving widow anymore. I was a soldier who had just received the launch codes. I hit the contact. It rang once. "Charles," I said. My voice was like a slab of cold granite. "The hostile force has breached the perimeter. They've moved the furniture. They've changed the locks. They think they've won the ground." On the other end in the silence was heavy. Then the sound of a match striking. The hiss of a cigar being lit. "Are you ready, Major?" Charles asked. "Begin the campaign," I replied. I ended the call and looked at the front door. Raymond was standing there, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking out at me with a smirk that said I was nothing. I didn't smirk back. I just shifted the Jeep into gear. The minefield was armed, and they were standing right in the center of it. The South Carolina sun was a brutal white eye in the sky, baking the Charleston asphalt, until the smell of boiling tar rose in thick, shimmering waves. Inside the Jeep, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of old upholstery and the ghost of Marcus's cologne. I watched through the windshield as Gerald and Timothy directed two hired hands in stained t-shirts. They were hauling heavy cardboard boxes from the front porch to the back of a 20-foot U-Haul truck. One box tore at the corner as it hit the metal floor. I saw the edge of my shadow box, the wood stained dark, the glass reflecting the harsh light. My medals, my life's work, tossed toward the truck bed like bags of cheap mulch. I didn't reach for the door handle right away. I checked my pulse. Steady. 62 beats per minute. I checked my breathing. Deep. Controlled. My husband was dead, my house was stolen, and my history was being treated like junk. I wasn't a mourning widow anymore. I was a barrier. I shoved the door open. The rusted hinge gave a sharp metallic scream that cut through the humid afternoon. My combat boots hit the gravel with a dry crunching sound. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked with the slow, deliberate gait of a soldier approaching a hostile checkpoint. I felt the heat of the driveway through my soles. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of the U-Haul's chrome grille. The engine was idling, a low, rhythmic thrum of diesel that vibrated in my teeth. I planted my feet, shoulders back, hands clasped behind my spine. Parade rest, a human wall. Gerald jumped down from the porch, his loafers clicking on the stone. He was sweating through his expensive polo shirt, the fabric sticking to his soft gut in damp, ugly patches. "Move the Jeep." "Lily." Gerald barked, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "We have a schedule to keep. This house needs to be cleared by sunset. Family estate orders. You're trespassing on Coleman land now." I didn't blink. I kept my gaze fixed on the driver behind the U-Haul's windshield. The man looked nervous. He kept glancing at Gerald, then back at me. He could see the steel in my eyes. He knew I wasn't moving. I was an immovable object. I said, "Move." Gerald stepped closer, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. "You think standing there changes anything? The locks are already changed. The papers are signed. You're done here, girl. Go back to Ohio and find a steel mill to rot in." I remained silent. My silence was a vacuum sucking the air out of his lungs. He wanted a fight, a screaming match he could record and show to a judge. I gave him a void. The front door of the house swung open. Raymond stepped out looking like a king surveying a peasant rebellion. He held a smartphone in one hand and a glass of expensive bourbon in the other. He didn't even look at me as he walked down the steps. He looked at the truck. "Problem, Gerald?" Raymond asked, his voice smooth and cold as a tombstone. "She won't move, Dad. She's blocking the exit." Gerald pointed a shaking finger at me. Raymond finally turned his eyes toward me. He took a slow sip of his drink, the ice clinking against the glass. He tapped his phone screen. "I'm calling the sheriff, Lily. I've already reported a drifter causing a disturbance on private property. A homeless veteran with a grudge. That's the narrative. And the Charleston police, they play golf at my club. Family estate." Raymond continued, leaning against the porch railing. "It's a powerful thing. It means we protect what is ours from outsiders. Marcus was a Coleman. You were just a mistake he made while he was away. A high-risk variable we're finally solving." The sun beat down on my head. My skin felt like it was simmering. But I didn't move a single millimeter. I thought about the Afghan nights, standing watch in a sandbagged bunker while the world ended in fire. If I could stand against the Taliban, I could stand against a man in a linen suit. I crossed my arms over my chest. I felt the hard line of my muscles under the fabric of my t-shirt. I was a human barricade, a living obstacle. "Drive," Raymond commanded the man in the truck. The driver hesitated. "Sir, I can't. She's right there." "I said drive," Raymond roared, slamming his glass onto the porch table. "She'll move. Nobody wants to be a hood ornament." The U-Haul's engine roared. A cloud of thick black diesel smoke erupted from the exhaust, stinging my eyes and coating my throat in the grit of burnt fuel. The driver shifted into gear. The truck lurched forward. 1 inch, 2 inches. The heat from the radiator hit my face. I could see the individual bugs caught in the grill. The smell of hot oil was sickening. Still, I didn't flinch. I watched the driver. His hands were white on the steering wheel. He was terrified. "One more foot," Gerald cheered from the sidelines, his eyes gleaming with a sick kind of joy. "Run the trailer trash over." The truck revved again. The bumper was inches from my waist. The vibration was a roar in my ears. I closed my eyes for a second, feeling the sun, the smoke, and the sheer weight of their hatred. Screech! A violent, high-pitched scream of rubber on asphalt tore through the air. It didn't come from the truck. It came from the street behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I heard the deep, guttural growl of a German V8 engine. A heavy door thudded shut, a solid, expensive sound that screamed authority. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with the diesel fumes. A black BMW 7 Series sat idling at the end of the driveway, blocking the U-Haul's only escape route. The windows were tinted dark like obsidian. Raymond's smirk vanished. Gerald stopped shouting. The driver killed the truck's engine. The silence that followed was heavy, lethal. The BMW's driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Gerald's car. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like an executioner with a briefcase. Charles Peaton adjusted his cufflinks and looked at the U-Haul. Then he looked at Raymond. "I believe," Charles said, his voice a low melodic threat, "that we have some things to discuss regarding grand larceny." I didn't move from my post. I just stared at Raymond. The minefield had just been stepped on. The black BMW 7 Series didn't just park. It occupied the space. The engine died and the driver's side door swung open, sealing shut with a heavy vacuum-tight thud that cut through the humid Charleston air like a gavel. Charles Peaton stepped onto the gravel. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like an executioner who had just finished a 3-piece suit fitting. His charcoal wool was crisp, unbothered by the 90-degree heat, and his eyes were cold as Atlantic slush. He didn't spare a glance for Raymond or the 2 sweating brothers. He walked straight to me, his gaze sweeping over my rigid posture and the idling U-Haul. "Major Woods," he said. His voice was a low melodic threat. He gave me a sharp, professional nod. "The cavalry has arrived. I apologize for the delay. The traffic on I-26 is as stagnant as the ethics in this driveway." Raymond stepped off the porch, his face a mottled purple. He tried to reclaim the air, puffing out his chest like a toad. "I don't know who you are, but you're on private property. This is a family matter. Get that German tank off my driveway before I have the sheriff tow it. We're in the middle of a legal transition." Charles didn't slow down. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a thick, matte black business card, and thrust it 6 inches from Raymond's nose. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a warning. "I don't shake hands with people committing grand larceny on a Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Coleman," Charles said. The words were short-clipped and heavy with the weight of a dozen Ivy League degrees used for violence. "I'm Charles Peaton, and unless you want the next 30 years of your life to be narrated by a public defender, you'll tell those men to stop touching the major's property immediately." Raymond went pale. The name Peaton carried the kind of weight that broke bones in the South. It was the name you called when you wanted to bury a body under a mountain of paperwork. Gerald, still standing by the back of the truck, started to stammer. "Wait, Dad, he can't. This is Marcus's house. The family estate. The estate." Charles barked, spinning on his heel to face Gerald. "Transferred to Major Lily Woods the moment Marcus's heart stopped. It's called a living trust, you idiot. It's automatic. There is no probate. There is no family vote. There is only her ownership, and you're trespassing." He looked at the 2 hired movers who were holding a box of my winter gear. "You two, put that down. now. If you put one more item in that truck, you're co-conspirators in a felony theft. I've already got your plates. Do you want to see if the Charleston County Jail has AC this time of year? The movers didn't wait for Raymond's permission. They dropped the box on the grass with a dull, hollow thud. "We're out, man," the taller one said, wiping grease onto his dirty jeans. "I'm not going to prison for some rich guy's sofa. This isn't what we signed up for." They scrambled into the cab, the U-Haul's engine roaring as they backed out, nearly clipping Gerald's Mercedes SUV. The sound of the diesel engine fading was the sound of Raymond's army deserting him in the heat. The silence that rushed back in was suffocating. The only smell left was the cheap, spicy cologne Gerald had doused himself in to hide his nervous sweat. It was cloying and desperate. Timothy backed up a step, his hands raised like he was being held at gunpoint. "Dad, maybe we should talk about this." "Shut up, Timothy," Raymond hissed, but the roar was gone from his voice. His hand, the one holding the half-empty bourbon, was shaking just enough to make the ice cubes clink. It was a rhythmic, pathetic sound. Charles adjusted his charcoal cuffs, the silver links flashing like a blade in the sun. He looked at the front door, then back at the trio of vultures. "We're not doing this on the lawn," Charles said. He gestured toward the porch with a cold, mocking politeness. "Inside, now. We're going to sit at that mahogany table you're so proud of and discuss exactly how much this little stunt is going to cost you in damages." Raymond tried to maintain his dignity, straightening his linen blazer, but his eyes were darting around the yard like a trapped rat in a maze. "I didn't say a word. I just stood my ground, my spine a steel rod, watching them retreat into the house they thought they had stolen. As I followed them up the steps, the heat didn't feel so heavy anymore. The smell of the humid marshes was replaced by the dry metallic scent of a brewing storm. If you've ever had to stand your ground when everyone tried to push you off your own land, hit that like button. Drop a "not today" in the comments to show your support for every soldier fighting a war at home. Subscribe to hear exactly how we dismantle this family piece by piece. We entered the foyer. The house was cold, the AC humming a low mechanical tune that felt like a funeral march. Charles walked straight to the dining room and slammed his heavy leather briefcase onto the table. The sound was like a gunshot. He looked at Raymond, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You people didn't just lose a house," Charles said, his voice dropping an octave into a predatory growl. "You just stepped onto a legal minefield Marcus spent the last year of his life arming, and I'm the one with the remote." He popped the locks on the briefcase. Snap! Snap! Raymond sat down, his face a ghostly, translucent white. Gerald and Timothy huddled behind him, looking like children caught stealing from the church plate. They looked small. They looked weak. "Let's talk about the no contest clause," Charles whispered, pulling out a thick stack of papers. "And then we're going to talk about the police report I'm currently holding in my left hand." The dining room felt like a meat locker. The air conditioning hummed with a low, aggressive vibration, pushing the scent of lemon polish and old mahogany against the bitter smell of Gerald's cold sweat. Raymond sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, nervous tattoo on the wood. He was still trying to play the part of the patriarch, but the glass of bourbon in his hand was shaking, the ice clinking against the crystal like a funeral bell. I stood in the corner, my back against the shadows, my spine a steel rod. I didn't sit. You don't sit when you're watching an execution. Charles Peaton sat opposite Raymond. He didn't look at the family. He looked at the heavy leather briefcase sitting on the table like a hunk of black shrapnel. He popped the latches. Snap! Snap! The sound made Patricia flinch. She was huddled in her chair, her silk scarf knotted tight around her throat, as if she were trying to keep her world from spilling out. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Charles said. His voice was a flat, lethal rasp. He reached into the case and pulled out the first thick stack of bond paper. He didn't hand it to them. He hurled it, he slammed it down onto the mahogany. Thud. "The deed and the clinic's operating license," Charles said. He tapped the top page with a manicured finger. "Marcus established a living trust 18 months ago. The second his death certificate was signed, ownership of this house and the veterinary practice transferred, automatically, to Lily Woods." Patricia let out a sharp, jagged gasp, her breath hitching in a throat that had suddenly gone dry. "That's impossible," she hissed, her voice cracking. "This is a Coleman house. My grandfather built these walls. You can't just give it to a girl from a steel town. I'm not giving it to her. Mrs. Coleman. Charles replied, a thin, predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The law already did. You're currently sitting in her chair, drinking her bourbon, breathing her air. If you don't like it, the front door is still where you left it. Gerald's hand shot out, reaching for the papers, but Charles slapped a second folder down on top of the first. Thud. Don't bother. Charles barked. This is the last will and testament. Marcus left every liquid asset, every piece of equipment, and every cent of his personal savings to his wife. Not to his brothers, not to his parents, to the major. The silence that followed was heavy enough to break ribs. Gerald looked at Timothy. Timothy looked at the floor. The greed in the room was so thick you could taste it, metallic and sour like old pennies. Raymond finally found his voice, though it sounded like it was being dragged over gravel. We'll fight it, Raymond growled, his face a deep, bruised purple. We've got the best estate lawyers in the state on retainer. We'll tie this girl up in probate until she's 80. We'll claim he wasn't of sound mind. We'll bury her in motions. Charles didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just reached back into the briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, translucent and crisp. He held it up like a trophy before letting it flutter onto the pile. Go ahead, Charles whispered. The coldness in his voice made the AC feel like a summer breeze. Page 42, the No Contest Clause, also known as the Suicide Clause for people like you. Raymond squinted at the text. His jaw began to work, his teeth grinding with a sound like shifting stone. For those of you who didn't graduate law school, Charles continued, leaning forward until he was inches from Raymond's face. The clause states that if any member of the Coleman family challenges this will or the trust in a court of law, they are immediately and irrevocably stripped of their standing in every other family fund Marcus was a part of. The secondary trusts, the real estate holdings, the legacy dividends. You sue her for this house and you lose your own house. You try to take her clinic and you lose your own bank accounts. He didn't just lock the door, Raymond. He rigged the whole house to blow if you tried to pick the lock. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Raymond's glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the table with a dull clunk before tipping over. The bourbon spilled across the mahogany, a dark amber stain spreading toward the legal documents. Patricia began to make a low keening sound in the back of her throat. Gerald's face went a sickly shade of gray, and he slumped back in his chair, the china cups on the sideboard rattling from the sudden shift in his weight. They were trapped. If they stayed quiet, they walked away with nothing. If they fought, they lost everything they already had. Marcus hadn't just protected me. He had led them into a kill zone and waited for them to trip the wire. He had used their own greed as the firing pin. I stepped out of the shadows. My boots made no sound on the heavy rug, but they all turned to look at me as if I were a ghost. I looked at Raymond, the man who had called me a high-risk variable. I looked at Patricia, the woman who had thrown my heart in the trash with a teal scarf. I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected. I just felt a cold, hard clarity. This was the mission. This was the final objective. That's the law, I said. My voice was steady, stripped of all emotion, sounding more like a combat report than a conversation. That's the part that keeps you off my lawn. But we're not done. I looked at Charles and gave him a single sharp nod. The signal. Now! I whispered the word, cutting through the room like a blade. Let's talk about my husband's legacy. Charles reached into the very back of his briefcase and pulled out a plain white envelope. No legal seals, no official stamps. Just Marcus's handwriting on the front, sharp and clear. The family froze. This wasn't a contract. This was a voice from the grave. The final letter, Charles announced, his hand hovering over the paper. And trust me, this one is going to hurt a lot more than the money. I stood at the end of the table, my hands clasped behind my back, watching the light die in Raymond's eyes. The war was over. Now came the reckoning. The parlor smelled like a morgue, soaked in cheap bourbon and expensive regret. Charles Peaton didn't rush. He pulled a single sheet of cream-colored paper from the white envelope, the crisp snap of the bond echoing against the mahogany walls like a small bone breaking. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a man about to perform an autopsy. Raymond sat paralyzed, his face the color of a bruised plum. Patricia had her face buried in a lace handkerchief, but the sobbing sounded rehearsed, a thin theatrical keening that didn't reach her eyes. "This isn't a legal contract," Charles said, his voice dropping into a low, jagged rasp. "This is a statement of fact. Marcus wrote this 3 days before the end. He knew you were coming. He knew the vultures wouldn't wait for the dirt to settle." Charles cleared his throat and began to read. The words weren't flowery. They were sharp, rhythmic, and cold. The final report of a man who had spent his life watching the people who were supposed to love him turn every heartbeat into a transaction. "To my father." Charles read, his gaze flicking to Raymond. "You never saw a son. You saw a portfolio. You spent 30 years trying to trade my happiness for a seat at a table that doesn't exist. You treated my marriage like a bad merger." Raymond's glass hit the table with a dull clack. He didn't look up. "To my mother." The letter continued. Charles's voice didn't soften. I watched you take the only person who truly cared for me, the woman who stood in the fire while you were busy picking out curtains, and try to strip her of her dignity. You treated her like the help because you were afraid of her strength. You gagged on your own vanity when she wouldn't bend." Patricia's handkerchief dropped. Her mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Her mouth hung open, a jagged hole in a face tight with Botox and terror. She looked at me, her eyes darting like a trapped bird searching for a crumb of the mercy I no longer had to give. "I loved Lily Woods because she is a soldier." Charles read, and for the first time, my chin tipped up an inch. "She was my moral compass in a family that lost North a long time ago. She's the only Coleman in this room who understands the meaning of an oath. She is my legacy. You are just my relatives." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence you find in a trench after the shells stop falling. My hands were clasped behind my back, my spine a steel rod. I didn't feel the heat of the sun anymore. I felt the cold, hard weight of a mission completed. Charles folded the paper with a slow, deliberate motion and slid it across the table. "The letter concludes with a simple directive," Charles said, looking at Gerald and Timothy. "It says, get out of her house." I stepped forward. My boots made no sound on the heavy rug, but Gerald and Timothy flinched as if I'd drawn a weapon. Their expensive polo shirts were dark with sweat, the smell of fear and cloying cologne filling the air. "You heard the man," I said. My voice was a flat line of granite. "But we're not quite through. You spent the morning hauling my life out to the grass like it was garbage." I gestured toward the lawn through the tall windows where my boxes and Marcus's old furniture sat in the dust. "Those movers are gone. You're the only muscle left." Gerald's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. We have people for that." "Not today you don't," I replied. I walked to the front door and swung it open. The humid South Carolina heat rushed in thick and heavy. Every box, every piece of furniture, you haul it back in, every single piece, exactly where it was. If I see a scratch on the wood or a tear in the cardboard, Charles starts filing the criminal trespass charges before you hit the driveway. The next 2 hours were a slow-motion study in humiliation. Gerald and Timothy, the princes of the Coleman estate, were reduced to pack mules. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching them struggle with the weight of an old, heavy armchair, the one Marcus's grandmother had given us. Gerald's face was beet red, sweat dripping from his chin onto his designer loafers. Timothy was huffing, his soft hands fumbling with the upholstery, his grip slipping as the grit from the driveway ground into his palms. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They looked like the thieves they were. They finished with the last box as the sun began to dip, casting long skeletal shadows across the lawn. They stood in the foyer, gasping for air, their clothes ruined, their dignity a pile of ash at their feet. Patricia stepped toward me, her hand reaching out as if to touch my sleeve. "Lily, we're still family. We can find a way to fix this. For Marcus's sake." I didn't let her finish. I didn't even let her breathe near me. "There is no us, Mrs. Coleman," I said. The words were a clean, final cut. "There's just the driveway. Use it." I watched them pile into their SUVs and roar away, the gravel spraying behind them like a desperate retreat. The house went still. I walked to the mailbox at the end of the drive. Inside was a single FedEx envelope. I ripped it open. A personal check fell out. $100,000. There was a note on Raymond's stationery for your silence, for the misunderstanding. Consider this a clean break. I looked at the check, then I looked at the house. I didn't smile. I just tore the paper in half, then in quarters. The war wasn't over. I hadn't even started the counteroffensive. Charleston is a city built on the weight of old names and the silence of deep graveyards. It does not take long for a secret to bleed out through the cracks in the cobblestones. By Thursday morning, the Coleman name was no longer a golden ticket to the high society of the South Carolina coast. It was a warning sign. Charles Peaton had worked the phones with the precision of a sniper. The news of the legal massacre at the mahogany dining table moved through the country clubs and the charity boards like a wildfire in dry grass. Patricia Coleman was quietly removed from the Botanical Garden Gala Committee. Gerald found out that his construction contracts for the new waterfront hotel were being reevaluated by the city council. The elite did not want the stench of grand larceny on their white gloves. I watched it happen from the windows of the house that was finally mine. I did not feel joy. I felt the cold, flat satisfaction of a mission objective being neutralized. The mail arrived at noon on Friday. The humidity was so thick it felt like breathing through a wet towel. A FedEx driver left a cardboard envelope on the porch and vanished before the dust could settle on the driveway. I took the package into the kitchen. The air conditioning was humming a steady mechanical tune, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the rooms Marcus used to fill. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream stationery with Raymond's initials embossed at the top. The letter was a masterpiece of cowardice. He used words like misunderstanding and family tension. He claimed that his actions were born out of a desire to protect the legacy of his son, a lie so transparent it made my stomach turn. Behind the letter sat a cashier's check, $100,000. It was hush money. It was the fuck you money the Colemans used to bury their sins and buy their way out of a conscience. Raymond thought every person had a price. He thought a soldier from a steel town in Ohio would see those 5 zeros and forget the way he had called her a drifter. He thought he could buy the honor Marcus had spent a lifetime building. I walked to the kitchen sink. The stainless steel was polished and cold under the fluorescent lights. I held the check over the basin, the paper feeling heavy and oily in my hand. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my military Zippo. The silver case was scratched and dented from 3 tours in the desert. I flicked the wheel with my thumb. The spark caught and a small orange flame danced in the stagnant air. I touched the fire to the corner of the $100,000 bribe. The paper did not just burn, it shriveled. The chemical ink turned a sickly iridescent purple before the black ash took over. The smell was foul, a mix of burning ink and hot glue that stung my nostrils. I watched the numbers melt. I watched the signature of the bank manager curl into a cinder. I did not blink until the flame reached my fingertips. I dropped the last glowing ember into the sink. I gathered the gray dust and the black flakes into a fresh envelope. I did not write a letter. I did not send a message. I just addressed it to Raymond's private office and sealed it. The ash would say more than 1,000 words ever could. It was the ultimate expression of contempt. The enemy was broken. Their money was smoke. Now, it was time to rebuild the base. I drove to the veterinary clinic on the edge of the marshes. It was a low building of brick and glass surrounded by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. It had been Marcus's sanctuary, a place where he healed things that were too broken for the rest of the world. Now it was a tomb of dust and forgotten appointments. I did not hire a cleaning crew. I did not want strangers touching his equipment. I rolled up my sleeves and started the work myself. I used a bucket of hot water, a gallon of bleach, and a stiff nylon brush. I scoured the linoleum floors until my shoulders ached. I scrubbed the grout in the surgery room until my knuckles were raw and bleeding. The physical pain was a mercy. It kept the ghosts at bay. It gave me a rhythm to follow, a tactical checklist of grime and neglect to overcome. By sunset, the lobby smelled like antiseptic and honest labor. I moved into Marcus's private office. It was a small room in the back filled with heavy oak furniture and the scent of old leather books. I started with the desk. I pulled out the drawers, emptying the pens, the old charts, and the half-eaten rolls of peppermint. The bottom drawer was heavy. It was a deep file drawer that felt off balance. I pulled it all the way out until it hit the stops. I reached into the dark space at the very back, my fingers grazing a loose layer of green felt lining. I yanked the felt back. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. Taped to the underside of the wood was a thick white envelope. It was not a legal document. It did not have the stamp of a notary or the seal of a firm. It was hand-sealed with a blob of red wax, the kind Marcus used for his private correspondence. Across the front, in the sharp, disciplined handwriting I had seen on 100 love letters, were 4 words for the final breach. My hand trembled as I peeled the tape away. The weight of the envelope told me this was not just a letter. There was something hard inside, something metallic. Marcus had one last secret. He had one last ghost to set free. I sat on the cold floor of the office, the shadow of the oak stretching across the desk like long, dark fingers. I broke the wax seal. The war was not over. It was just changing fronts. The wax seal didn't crumble. It snapped under the pressure of my thumb, a sharp sound in the dead silence of Marcus's office. I sat on the cold linoleum, the smell of bleach still stinging my nose, and pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't typed on a law firm's letterhead. It was Marcus. His handwriting was loose, a little shaky, written when the cancer had already started its final sweep, but the spirit behind the ink was as sharp as a bayonet. There was no talk of the house, no mention of the money or the bank accounts or the sharks in the Coleman family. Those were just the defensive fortifications he had built to keep me safe. This letter was the mission. To my major, it began. My throat tightened, a hard knot of steel and grief. If you're reading this, the breach has happened. I know my family. I know they came for the walls before the body was even cold. And I know you, Lily. I know you stood there and held the line because that's what you do. You're a soldier. You're the best thing I ever chose. But here is your final order, Major. The war is over. You've defended the base. Now I need you to build something else. Don't let this house be a fortress of ghosts. Turn it into a lighthouse. Your mission isn't to mourn me. Your mission is to live. I didn't cry. Soldiers don't leak when there is work to do. I folded the paper into a tight square unit and slid it into the breast pocket of my charcoal t-shirt, right against the steady, rhythmic thud of my heart. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room. The shadows of the oaks outside were long and thin, stretching across the floor like skeletal fingers. But they didn't feel heavy anymore. They were just shadows. 30 days passed. 30 sunrises over the Charleston marshes. I didn't sell the clinic. I didn't let the equipment rust. Instead, I scoured the place until it gleamed like a fresh-pressed uniform. The smell of old neglect was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of cedar and high-grade antiseptic. I hired 2 vet techs, both Army veterans who knew how to handle a crisis and a frightened animal with the same steady hands. The new sign went up on a Tuesday morning. It was heavy brass bolted deep into the brick. The Marcus Coleman Memorial Veterinary Hospital. Underneath, in smaller, clean lettering, Service Animals and Veteran Support Center. The trend in the South was changing, but I didn't care about trends. I cared about the men and women who came home from the desert with invisible holes in their souls, and a service dog as their only anchor. We made it free for them. Every checkup, every surgery, every bag of high-protein kibble. The money Raymond had tried to use as a bribe, I didn't burn all of it. I turned it into a foundation that made sure no soldier ever had to choose between their own groceries and their dog's life. It was 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, 1 month after the Colemans had been purged from the driveway. The Charleston air was salt-heavy and cool, the kind of morning that makes you feel the weight of your own skin. I stood on the back porch of the house, dressed in my old gray PT gear. My hair was pulled back tight, a practical knot that didn't catch the wind. I started my routine. Standard military press, squats, push-ups until the muscles in my chest burned and the sweat turned my shirt into a second skin. It wasn't about the fitness anymore. It was about the discipline. It was about reclaiming the body that had spent too long hunched over a hospital bed. I finished the set and leaned against the porch railing, my breath coming in deep, controlled draws. Inside the house was silent and spotless. The honors wall had been rebuilt in the hallway, my medals, Marcus's degrees, and the shadow box of his grandfather's flag. They didn't look like trophies anymore. They looked like a history that had been defended and won. A low rhythmic thump sounded from the mudroom. I walked inside the floorboards, cool under my bare feet. A black Labrador, a retired service dog named Scout that we were fostering, looked up at me. He didn't bark. He just wagged his tail once the sound hitting the wood with a solid, healthy thud. I knelt down and rubbed the space behind his ears, feeling the warmth of him. "Let's go, Scout," I whispered. I walked to the front door and stepped out into the morning. The sun was just starting to crack the horizon, a sliver of brilliant white-hot gold that turned the marsh grass into a sea of fire. The Coleman SUVs were gone. The lawyers were silent. The vultures had found easier prey. I adjusted the collar of my shirt and looked out toward the clinic. The brass sign caught the first rays of light flashing like a beacon in the gray dawn. Marcus was right. The fortress was gone. The lighthouse was lit. I took a long, deep breath of the Atlantic air, feeling the salt in my lungs and the strength in my legs. The war was a memory. The mission was a reality. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes of a betrayal, or if you believe that our veterans and their animals deserve a fighting chance, share this story. Let's show the world that honor can't be bought and that a soldier's heart never truly retires. Comment, "Mission complete" below to stand with Lily. I stepped off the porch and onto the gravel. The crunch under my boots was the only sound in the world. I didn't look back at the house. I looked straight ahead at the light. Mission complete.